So I have another question from Jay, and it reads, how did the kingdoms of Judah and Israel become one, and how come no other peoples were included? Or were some other groups included? One thing we have to understand about the Old Testament is that it's really not historical. And so when it talks about the united kingdoms of Israel and Judah, it isn't necessarily referring to something that actually occurred or a state of being between these two nations that ever actually existed. So, from what I can gather, the first time Israel and Judah were united as a sort of single nation with rulership from Jerusalem, it was, I believe, in the mid 2nd century BC under John Hyrcanus. He ruled from Judah, and he essentially annexed the northern kingdom of Israel. And there is a theory floating around that some of these stories that we find in the books of Kings were essentially a way of saying that Israel and Judah had always been united in order to provide a sort of precedent for combining these two nations that had never before been considered a single country. And as far back as we look, we find that these two nations were being ruled separately and were frequently at war with one another, even as late as the Babylonian exile. Israel had been its own separate nation and was then conquered by the Assyrians. And then Judah, still separate, was then conquered by the Babylonians. After that, beginning the Second Temple period, they were still two separate nations. And so it's difficult to say for certain, but it looks like the idea of Israel and Judah being a single nation didn't actually happen until about 2,200 years ago. And the stories about the two nations being united before that is actually a sort of a political propaganda to justify the annexation of Israel by the kingdom of Judah. Now, as far as other people being excluded, we do have references to this. So in some of our books, like I believe Joshua, we have references to the Jebusites who lived in the city of Jerusalem and around that area, who still lived in the land until a fairly late date, but were not considered the same as the rest of the Israelites. So there were people who lived in the area who were not considered to be part of the same population, mainly because their beliefs were different from the people who were writing these stories. Now, the people themselves were all essentially Canaanites. There's no real difference between a Canaanite and an Israelite. The Israelites were a group of Canaanites. The distinction that they draw is actually one of generation, not of ethnicity. What they're mainly doing in the Old Testament when they're talking about the Canaanites is they're referring essentially to their ancestors who held to one type of worship. And the people who are writing these stories, they have an evolved sort of worship, and they have a very dim view of the older style of worship. And so they pretend that the people with this different style of religion is not actually their ancestors, their relatives, but a completely separate ethnic group. And a lot of this comes from a sort of conflict during the Second Temple period when refugees were coming from Babylon. These were captive Jews who had been imprisoned in Babylon after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. When they were returning, their religion had evolved a great deal during their captivity. They'd been gone for more than a generation. So when they came back, they had a very different view of their place in the world, their practices, the land, and so on. And since they had the financial and political backing of the Persian Empire, they were able to assert their beliefs onto the population. And when they did this, it created a sort of conflict. And one of the ways they dealt with this conflict was to essentially label anyone who held to the old beliefs as essentially filthy Canaanites. And they do this frequently in the Old Testament. And so there were a great many people that were not considered part of Israel, but they weren't necessarily different people. They were just groups that didn't hold to the same beliefs as the groups that were in power. And the polemic that the groups in power used was essentially by claiming that these people didn't actually belong there.